About 6 hours after Gaetz announced he was stepping down, Trump announced his replacement pick. He has named former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi as his pick for U.S. Attorney General. Bondi currently works for the conservative think tank America First Policy Institute. She was also a member of Trump's legal team during his first impeachment trial in 2020. I want to bring in Ed O'Keefe right now. Ed, thank you for being here. What do we know about Bondi's relationship with the president-elect and her credentials?
Lindsay, this is a 59-year-old legal professional who's been in the public political and legal space now for roughly 10 years or so, and was one of the earliest converts or acolytes for Trump back in the day, someone who even traces her political lineage to support she received from Sarah Palin and the early Tea Party movement. So this is someone that is consistent with sort of the Trump legacy or the MAGA movement as we've come to know it. Again, 59 years old, served 2 terms as Florida's Attorney General, perhaps best remembered in many ways for leading the legal challenges to the Affordable Care Act, trying to overturn it with other Republican attorneys general across the country. Also someone who raised questions about the fact that the Affordable Care Act was trying to make it easier for people with pre-existing conditions to get covered. That was among the things that these attorneys general challenged at the time. An early supporter of the former president-elect, we're still getting used to saying that, and perhaps no surprise that someone like her would have been in the mix, given that loyalty to him for all these years. As you mentioned, she has spent much of the past year running this Trump-aligned policy institute, but perhaps also notable, she was one of his defense attorneys in his first impeachment trial before the U.S. Senate. So again, he's gone and picked somebody who has personally represented him to serve in a top legal role on behalf of the entire country. The other being Todd Blanche, who has most recently represented him in New York and in other legal matters, has already been tapped and will be eventually nominated to serve as the Deputy Attorney General. So, in essence, the Justice Department would be represented and would be led by 2 lawyers who personally represented him in either courts of law or political courts of impeachment.
So in comparison with Gaetz, it appears that the loyalty box is checked. Will she have an easier time, you think, among senators, particularly Republican senators, in getting confirmed?
Well, let's tick through why Matt Gaetz had issues and why we don't think Pam Bondi will. She hasn't, as far as we know, been the subject of a House ethics investigation. She isn't, as far as we know at this hour at least, the subject of a Justice Department investigation of any kind. She is someone who has a conservative legal record and a record of running a law enforcement division. It was the Florida Department of Justice in her case. So she comes out of the mold of many previous U.S. attorneys general, someone who's run things at the state level or who has expertise in federal court challenging various laws or trying to get other things changed. What's different and what is uniquely Trump about it all, of course, is her loyalty to him both politically and legally. And that probably makes this an easier choice for many of those Republican senators to eventually support her. Remember, we were reporting earlier today, at least 8 Republican senators, I was told as many as 15, could have eventually voted against Gaetz, given the challenges he was facing, that ethics investigation, the concerns about his personal behavior, and the general concern that this was somebody who had never served in this kind of a role, serving as the top prosecutor of the United States. Sure, he was loyal to Trump. Sure, he's been there by his side. Yes, he's a lawyer in practice, but never have done something like what Pam Bondi had done. And when you consider the other people that were being considered, as we were told, she was on lists. The Missouri Attorney General was on the list. Some had talked about the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton. There's Matt Whitaker, the former Attorney General, who's now been set to be nominated to serve as ambassador to NATO. There's a guy named John Ratcliffe who used to serve as intelligence director for Trump and is now set to be nominated to run the CIA. So there were a mix of people with more traditional Republican or conservative legal backgrounds in the mix, and Bondi certainly is one of them.
Right. When the president-elect posts on Truth Social that Matt Gaetz was doing well, the numbers would not reflect that. Ed, Bondi is not the first person from the America First Policy Institute that Trump has tapped to join his administration. What can you tell us about the group and why that's significant?
I believe Linda McMahon is one of the other ones, right? She's one of the benefactors of the group. This is someone who is expected to be nominated. We have to be careful about this because there's been no formal nomination. He's not president yet, but expected to be nominated to serve as education secretary in the case of Linda McMahon. This is one of those organizations that's been stood up by his supporters in recent years to try to take the belief system of the MAGA movement and write it into potential federal policy. And so the work that McMahon was doing at that group, the work that Pam Bondi and others has been doing, is the kind of work you'll see potentially play out in a Trump administration. Yes, these are the kind of people that were contributing to Project 2025 and other documents that have been put together by the party as it's out of power in anticipation of getting back in power. And so both of them aligned with this group, which is essentially a think tank, but otherwise the policy arm of the MAGA movement, or one of them.
I want to talk about Florida because Florida has sort of been like the unspoken cabinet member. I mean, we have Susie Wiles, his former campaign co-chair, now chief of staff, one of the most well-respected and considered successful Republican operatives in Florida. Marco Rubio of Florida tapped as Secretary of State. Mike Waltz of Florida tapped for NSA. Obviously, Matt Gaetz, who was tapped for Attorney General of Florida, even though he's withdrawn. Trump wanted Rick Scott to be Senate Majority Leader, although it ultimately went to John Thune, Rick Scott of Florida. What can you tell us about Trump world? We know that now Florida is, well, where you are physically and also where Trump considers home. What can you tell us about the influence of Florida politics in the new incoming administration?
Yeah, home is for him just a few miles over there across the water. And he's been here, of course, since the election, save for that trip to New York over the weekend, and to see President Biden in Washington here, starting to put together his government. And yes, increasingly relying on Sunshine State residents to fill out some of these posts. It all begins with Susie Wiles, someone who elected Ron DeSantis to the governorship back in 2018, then had a political divorce with him, a really nasty one that compelled her to go work for Trump instead of DeSantis when he ran for president earlier in the last year or so, 2024. And so, given her connections to people in this state, Trump's affinity for them, and familiarity with their work, given that he's been a resident here for the last several years, it's no surprise that he's tapped into various Florida officials. All of it creates, in the case of Gaetz and Waltz and Rubio, some headaches for Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, which the president-elect and Susie Wiles are fine doing because they're not necessarily fans of his still, even though he is, of course, expressing public support. Are there other people in the Florida political system who may end up in the Trump administration? Absolutely. Who are they? Unclear. Are there other people who work on the sidelines of it or around the margins as consultants and lobbyist types who likely are going to find some kind of a role either on the inside or right on the outside? Again, absolutely. This is the most MAGA-represented state, if you will, representative of the MAGA movement, in that he's become a resident here, is familiar with its politics, and has gotten to know a lot of these individuals, especially the members of Congress. So don't be surprised if there are others that come out of here. And the Bondi pick is totally consistent with the spirit in which they're trying to strike and the kind of individual he's looking for. And again, absent some other personal matter that we're unaware of, likely going to get near unanimous, if not total, Republican Senate support, and be someone that drives Democrats nuts, which is exactly what Trump's looking for anyway.
On that note, is Pam Bondi the type of attorney general who would flip the DOJ upside down? And is Pam Bondi the Retribution AG pick that we have heard Trump sort of speak in that vein on the trail that Gaetz was believed to be?
That is unclear at this early hour after this announcement. But it's telling, Lindsay, that in the last day or so, Gaetz and his allies on Capitol Hill had been sort of going around and clarifying what exactly they meant by retribution, suggesting that maybe it wouldn't be as dramatic as promised or suggested in the past in some of their public statements. The idea being that he wasn't going to turn Justice Department prosecutors on Liz Cheney, as some had feared, and he's been reported to have said that to some lawmakers in the conversation. So is she someone who's going to be sensitive to that? Probably. But has she been involved in sort of actively stoking that possibility? Not to my recollection. But again, certainly going to be seen, at least by Republicans, as a professional prosecutor who knows how to run this kind of a entity, the Justice Department, given that she ran a state-level one and one of the biggest and most active during the Obama era when she was in the job and the early years of the Trump administration, the first Trump administration.
So perhaps maybe she's considered a more traditional pick for this type of role. Let's turn to somebody considered less traditional, and that is President-elect Trump's pick for Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who is on the Hill today meeting with some Republican senators. What do we know about the headwinds that he faces in confirmation?
Well, he continues to face them, and he met with some senators today, a handful expressing full-throated support, like John Barrasso, the number 3 Senate Republican, suggesting that, if the president wants him to be his top national security pick, he deserves to have him. There are others we're anticipating that are going to raise concerns specifically about these allegations of sexual assault, as detailed in a California police report that was released overnight, an incident from October 2017 in Monterey, California, where a woman alleges that she had some kind of encounter with him, had repeatedly told him no, had her phone taken away, exactly the kind of thing that there are many Republican senators wouldn't want to see associated with someone who's going to oversee one of the largest organizations in the world and the most powerful military in the world at a time when they've been recruiting and celebrating and elevating women into positions of real power and influence across the military. He, of course, has been publicly quoted as saying he doesn't necessarily think they should be in combat. So that one's the next tricky one. And let's see if he doesn't suffer a fate similar to Gaetz. Maybe the opposition will not have been as widespread, but I suspect it'll be similar to some extent, and also notable that perhaps female Republican senators, I'm thinking of Joni Ernst, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and others, may express reservation, especially in the case of Joni Ernst, given her military service and the fact that she has said she was a victim of sexual assault while in the ranks. So she has some direct experience with something that is obviously, bedeviling Hegseth's options right now, or chances right now. And with Gaetz out of the picture and a more traditional pick made for AG, you better believe a lot of that heat and scrutiny is going to now turn to Hegseth in the coming days.
Ed, what positions are left to be picked? What are you watching for?
We were waiting on Treasury Secretary. We know that in recent days, Trump has interviewed a handful of candidates for that role. A lot of opinions in Trump world among his donors, among his top advisors about who exactly it should be. And the pick would potentially also reflect what the economic focus and priorities will be. Will there be a lot of focus on tariffs? Will there be a lot of focus on the tax plan that has to be renewed and potentially expanded next year? Is this someone who's seen as, friendly to corporations, or someone who's going to stick it to them on behalf of the MAGA base? So Treasury is a big one. You still need to find a labor secretary, an agriculture secretary, a housing and urban development secretary, head of the Small Business Administration, head of the Council of Economic Advisors. But remember, the pace he's keeping, even with this fumble today with the Attorney General, is faster than previous recent transitions. The goal had been, and best we can tell remains, name all these picks by Thanksgiving, so by next Tuesday, and allow them to then begin the process of meeting with senators, setting up confirmation hearings early in January, potentially before he even takes office, and then having votes shortly thereafter. We'll wait and see. But we're basically down to 5, Treasury being the big one. And now 6, I guess, if you count. Well, no, he named Bondi, so yeah, we're still at 5.
Yeah. All right. CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, thank you. For more, let's go to Tom LoBianco. He is a national politics reporter and co-founder of 24 Site News. Tom, what's your assessment of Bondi? What do you make of this pick?
Much safer pick than Matt Gaetz, clearly. Also somebody with some deep roots inside of Trump world and Florida politics, of course. Early on in the nomination process, there was a lot of talk about how longtime Florida Republican, Trump campaign manager, and incoming White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles had her hands on the controls. And this certainly feels like that, a more acceptable pick broadly, and somebody who has been involved with Trump for years now, going back to the first administration. So certainly less problematic, politically speaking, than Matt Gaetz.
How much political capital did President-elect Trump spend on the Matt Gaetz pick?
Quite a bit. If you coming out of the gate, after the election, issuing so many threats publicly, surrounding himself with people issuing a lot of public threats about the exercise of power, I mean, I spoke with one of my Trump world sources last week about this, and just a week ago was telling me that, oh yeah, we're going to ram this down the Senate's throat. They're going to have to accept this. The recess, if they don't want to vote on it, they don't want to do confirmation hearings, we'll use recess appointments. It was a very firm stance back then. And now, having gone through the process, to have him back out like that is just really astounding. And I think you see that reflected in the selection of Bondi.
Do you sort of see what we just saw over the last week as sort of a push and pull between Trump and Senate Republicans to sort of maybe for Trump to see how far he could push them and for Senate Republicans to sort of push back and say, no, we have an advisement and confirmation role here, and we're going to take that seriously?
Absolutely. I mean, yes, this was one of the first big tests. And you certainly saw the Senate Republicans say, specifically that, look, we are a separate branch of government, the Congress, and it is a constitutional duty to advise and consent. You look at the timing of when Gaetz was announced, and it was very impulsive, according to all the reporting around this. It was right after John Thune was elected the Senate Majority Leader, the incoming Senate Majority Leader for the Republicans. Not a hard MAGA choice. So you have to look at that. You have to look at the votes that are possible, too. You also have to consider, too, the House comes into play here. And this is really fascinating because you need the House to be able to do a recess appointment. You need to have a vote of the House to do recess long enough to make that appointment. And this goes into the personal relationships that Matt Gaetz did not have in the House in particular. So
the House has to sign off for the Senate to go on recess, essentially, and allow those recess appointments?
Congress has to go on. Yeah, the whole Congress has to go on recess. So it's not just the Senate. Yeah. So this was a major flex of power by both the Senate and the House Republicans here saying, hey, you got to work with us.
So now that Gaetz has withdrawn and we have Pam Bondi as the pick, we heard Ed O'Keefe there reporting that maybe some of that scrutiny and pressure is now going to go to Defense Secretary pick Pete Hegseth. I don't know if you've run the numbers. How many Republican senators can he afford to lose?
Well, if McCormick stands in Pennsylvania, that gives him a margin of 53-47. And again, seeing that recess appointments does not seem likely in this scenario, would have to make it out of confirmation, make it through here the vetting hearings, onto the floor of the Senate, where you would need to get 51. All right, that's tough. Senators Murkowski, as Ed mentioned just a second ago there, Senators Murkowski up in Maine, Sue Collins, Joni Ernst, that could potentially be problematic. But don't forget, too, you've got Mitch McConnell still in the Senate, and he's more than likely to leave at the end of his term, but he's still serving this term. Lame ducks, the flip side of lame ducks not having power to exert is that they also don't have to worry about being reelected. So, and he's very big on NatSec and national security and intelligence. Those are two big areas for him. So that getting to 53 could be very hard for some of these more controversial picks like Hegseth.
So just one more question, because I'm terrible at math. He has a 2-vote margin. He can only afford to lose 2.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm thinking that in my head too.
Okay. Tom LoBianco. We'll do some extra math exercises later. Thank you so much.
Thank you.